You know that feeling of safety you get when you lock your door at night? It's a fragile thing, isn't it? We draw the curtains, check the latch, and tell ourselves that all the dangers of the world are now on the other side of that wall. We convince ourselves we're in a sanctuary, a sealed fortress where nothing can get to us, but that's a comforting lie we tell ourselves. The truth is, the lock on your door is a simple little mechanism. The walls of your home aren't impenetrable, and the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones who have to break down the door to get to you. They're the ones who are already inside. You hear a strange noise and peek through the blinds, but what if the real danger isn't outside? These three terrifyingly true stories are about what happens when the person you fear is already in your home. Back in 1941, Denver, Colorado was a city like any other. On West Moncrief Place lived 73-year-old Philip Peters, a retired railroad worker who had built a quiet, predictable life with his wife, Helen. Their home was their castle. Peters was a man of routine, a man who believed in the security of his own four walls. He had no idea that the greatest threat to his life wasn't lurking on the streets, but was breathing the same air as him, just a few feet above his head. The story of how that threat got there is both strange and tragic. Years earlier, Peters had known a young man named Theodore Coneys. Coneys was a sickly, frail kid who had briefly been in the same mandolin club as Peters. Being a kind man, Peters had even invited the struggling young Coneys into his home for dinner a few times. Coneys was an awkward and bitter young man, resentful of his poor health. He once told the Peters family that his dream was to live in a cave, hidden away from the world. Soon after, Coneys left town, and the Peters family forgot all about him. Life was hard on Coneys. He drifted from place to place, his dreams of a music career turning into a life of just trying to get by. In September of 1941, now a gaunt, 58-year-old drifter, Coneys ended up back in Denver, completely broke. He remembered Philip Peters and the kindness he'd been shown, but he didn't knock on the door to ask for help. Instead, he waited for the house to be empty and broke in, planning to just steal some food and money. While he was rummaging through the house, he found something. Inside a closet, he saw a small, unassuming trapdoor in the ceiling. He pried it open and looked inside. It was a cramped, dusty attic crawl space, barely big enough for a person to fit. To anyone else, it would be a filthy, disgusting hole. But to Theodore Coneys, it was the cave he had always dreamed of. It was a place to hide, so he decided to stay. For 5 weeks, Coneys lived in that attic, a silent parasite in the Peters home. He would listen, learning the rhythms of their daily lives, the creak of the floorboards, the murmur of their conversations, the exact times they would leave the house. Only when he was absolutely certain they were gone would he slip down from his hiding place like a ghost, steal food from their fridge, and then retreat back into the darkness above. Then, on October 17th, 1941, Coneys made a fatal mistake. He thought Philip Peters had left the house, so he crept down from the attic, starving. He made his way to the kitchen and was standing right in front of the refrigerator when he heard a noise behind him. Philip Peters hadn't left. He had just been taking a nap. He woke up to find a spectral, disheveled man raiding his kitchen. For a second, there was shocked recognition. Peters, though elderly, wasn't about to be pushed around in his own home. He grabbed his cane and lunged at the intruder, yelling at him to get out. Panic seized Coneys. This was his worst fear, being discovered. He grabbed an old pistol he'd found in the house and started bludgeoning the old man. The gun literally broke apart from the force of the blows. So he grabbed a heavy iron stove shaker and continued the brutal attack until Philip Peters lay dead on his kitchen floor. His heart pounding, Coneys didn't run. Instead, he dragged Peters' body to a less obvious spot, cleaned up the blood as best he could, and then climbed back through the closet, up into the suffocating darkness of his crawl space. He went back to his nest. The police were stumped. They found the body, but there were no signs of forced entry and no murder weapon. The case went cold. Helen Peters, overwhelmed with grief and dealing with her own health problems, was hospitalized for a time. The house on West Moncrief Place sat empty, except for the man living silently in its attic. When Mrs. Peters finally returned home, a friend moved in to help her. But it wasn't long before they both realized something was deeply wrong. They'd hear strange noises at night, faint scuttling sounds from the walls, a soft click from another room. Food would disappear from the pantry. Small things would be moved. The unease grew into a real, palpable fear. It felt like the ghost of Philip Peters was haunting the house. They called the police again and again. Officers would come and search the house from top to bottom, but they never found a thing. How could they? They were looking for a ghost, not a living, breathing man who had become an expert at melting into the forgotten spaces of the house. The officers would leave, and the women would be left alone again with that creeping dread. Eventually, the friend couldn't take the oppressive atmosphere any longer and moved out. Now, Helen Peters was truly alone with the man living above her. The strange things kept happening, a subtle campaign of terror from a man just trying to stay hidden. This went on for months, with Mrs. Peters living in constant fear, believing she was being tormented by the supernatural. The whole ordeal finally ended on July 30th, 1942, almost 10 months after the murder. 2 police officers were doing another routine check on the house. As they moved through the second floor, one of the officers heard a sound that made the hairs on his arm stand up, the soft, unmistakable click of a lock turning from inside a closet. They burst towards the sound, flung the closet door open, and looked up just in time to see a pair of grimy legs disappearing into the ceiling. They grabbed the man's legs and pulled with all their might, dragging the emaciated, filthy form of Theodore Coneys out of the darkness. The ghost of West Moncrief Place had a name. He was gaunt, covered in filth and cobwebs, and blinked in the light like a creature that hadn't seen the sun in forever. When police sent their smallest officer up into the crawl space, he was repulsed by what he found. Coneys had made a nest, saving his own waste in a corner, living in unimaginable squalor. The officer reportedly gagged and said, "A man would have to be a spider to stand it long up there." The name stuck. The newspapers dubbed Coneys the Denver Spider-Man. In custody, Coneys confessed to everything. He told them how he'd lived in the house for weeks before the murder, and for 9 months after, sharing a home with the very woman he'd made a widow. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he ironically said he would finally have a better home than he'd had in years. He died in prison in 1967. The case of Theodore. Coneys is the ultimate true story of what we now call frogging, secretly living in someone else's home. It preys on our deepest fears, not of a violent break-in, but of a quiet, slow-burning one. It's the horrifying thought that the sanctity of your home could be violated for weeks, or even months, without you ever knowing. The creaks you dismiss as the house settling, the food you thought you misplaced, that feeling of being watched you shook off as paranoia, it was all real. It was a man living in your walls. Coney's story is a chilling reminder that even the most secure homes have hidden vulnerabilities. But sometimes the terror doesn't come from a hidden space. It comes from being trapped somewhere with no hidden spaces at all, where you're completely exposed and the walls feel like they're made of glass. For a group of college friends, renting a cabin for the weekend was supposed to be an escape from exams and city life. They found the perfect spot online, a rustic, isolated cabin deep in a forest, miles from anywhere. It promised campfires, late-night talks, and a total disconnect from the world. As they drove down the long, winding dirt road, losing cell service with every mile, they felt a thrill of excitement. The isolation was the whole point. They had no idea it would soon become the source of pure primal terror. The first evening was perfect. They unpacked, built a roaring fire, and filled the cabin with laughter. The huge, dark forest outside was just a black wall beyond the cheerful glow of the windows, a silent backdrop to their cozy retreat. As the night went on and the fire died down, they started heading to bed. One of the friends, Mark, was the last one up. He was heading to his room when a flicker of movement outside the living room window caught his eye. He paused, thinking it was just a branch. But then he looked again, and his blood ran cold. Standing just off the porch, partly hidden by the dark, was a man. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, still as a statue, his face turned towards the house. Towards Mark. He was watching. For a second, Mark was frozen. His mind raced, trying to find an explanation. A neighbor? There were no neighbors for miles. A lost hiker? The slate? Every logical reason just evaporated, leaving only the chilling truth. There was a stranger outside their isolated cabin, in the middle of the night, staring at them. He backed away from the window, his heart hammering his ribs. He ran to his friend David's room, shook him awake, and whispered frantically what he saw. David stumbled out into the living room and peered cautiously out the window. He saw him too. The man hadn't moved an inch. The sight jolted David into action. "I'm turning on the porch light," he whispered. Before Mark could say anything, David flicked the switch. The porch was instantly flooded with harsh yellow light, illuminating the empty space where the man had been. He was gone. Vanished into the blackness of the forest as if he'd never been there at all. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline, David threw the door open and ran out onto the porch, shouting into the night. But there was only silence. The wind rustled through the pines, a lonely, mournful sound. The man was gone. Sleep was now impossible. The cozy atmosphere of the cabin was shattered, replaced by a thick, suffocating dread. The friends, now all awake and terrified, huddled together in the living room. The isolation they had wanted now felt like a trap. They were miles from help with no cell service. They spent the rest of the night barricading the doors with furniture and arming themselves with whatever they could find: a fire poker, a heavy skillet, a couple of logs from the firewood pile. Every creak of the old cabin sent a fresh wave of panic through them. They took turns keeping watch, staring out into the oppressive darkness, half expecting to see the man's face pressed against the glass. Morning finally came, bringing a fragile sense of relief, but also a new, more disturbing discovery. They carefully unbarricaded the door and stepped outside to circle the cabin, looking for any sign of their visitor. What they found was worse than they could have imagined. In the soft, damp earth around the cabin was a set of footprints. They were bare human footprints. They formed a complete, deliberate circle around the entire house. The group followed the tracks, a growing sickness in their stomachs. The footprints didn't just circle the cabin. They stopped methodically at every single window. The man hadn't just been standing there. He had been systematically peeking into every room, watching them, but the real horror was yet to come. The cabin had 2 floors. As they followed the trail to the back of the house, they looked up. There, in the soft dirt of the embankment that rose up to the back of the cabin, were more footprints. They led right up to the second-story windows, to the rooms where the others had been sleeping, completely unaware. There were clear prints in the dirt directly beneath their bedroom windows. He had been looking in on all of them as they slept. Logic would tell you to pack up and leave immediately, but a mixture of youthful defiance and disbelief led them to a reckless decision. They would stay the second night. They paid for the weekend, and they weren't going to be scared off by some creep. They told themselves he was long gone, that the light had spooked him for good. But as dusk began to fall, their bravado evaporated. The fear came rushing back. The forest that seemed beautiful in the daylight once again became a menacing black void. The cabin, their shelter, now felt like a fishbowl. Every window was a potential stage for the watcher. The sense of being observed was constant and overwhelming. They couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. That second night was pure psychological torment. They didn't even try to sleep. They sat in the main room, backs against the wall, trying to keep all the windows in their sight. The fire poker never left someone's white-knuckled grip. Every sound was amplified. An owl hooting, a twig snapping. Was that him? Is he on the porch? Is he at the window again? It wasn't just a fleeting glimpse of a man anymore. It was the cold, hard evidence of the footprints. Proof that someone had been there, methodically studying them, invading their privacy in the most terrifying way. The fact that the footprints were barefoot just added a layer of bizarre, unsettling mystery. Who wanders barefoot through a cold forest at night? The night crawled by. They kept all the lights on, creating a small bubble of defiance in the vast wilderness. But the light also turned the windows into black mirrors, reflecting their own terrified faces back at them, while the darkness outside remained a total unknown. When the sun finally rose, the relief was absolute. They didn't make breakfast. They threw their stuff in their bags and practically ran to the car. As they drove away down that long dirt road, no one looked back. They never found out who the man was or why he was there. Was he a local, a squatter, something else? The question haunted them. It's a terrifying story about how quickly isolation can turn from a comfort to a curse, and how the thin pane of glass separating you from a threat is really no barrier at all. Being watched in an isolated cabin is horrifying, but at least there are walls and a locked door, however fragile they feel. What happens when you're completely exposed, with no shelter to run to, and the person watching you decides they want to get closer? For a lot of people, the wilderness is a place of peace, a place to disconnect. Beth was one of those people. She was an avid hiker and often went out on the quiet forest trails near her home. She was experienced, always prepared, and she respected nature. But the biggest danger she would ever face on a trail wouldn't be a wild animal or bad weather. It would be a man. It was a beautiful, crisp autumn day. Beth was several miles into her hike, enjoying the familiar rhythm of her boots on the trail. It was pretty quiet out, and she'd only passed a couple of other people near the start. She loved this feeling of being alone with her thoughts, surrounded by nature. The first time she saw him, it was just a glimpse. He was standing off the trail, partly hidden behind a big oak tree, and seemed to be looking her way. She noticed him, but didn't think much of it. It was a public trail. She gave a little nod and kept walking, but as she went on, a small, nagging feeling started to creep in. Something about the way he was standing, so still and focused, felt off. A mile or so later, she stopped for some water. As she was putting the bottle back in her pack, she heard a twig snap behind her. She turned, and her heart jumped. It was the same man. He was standing on the trail about 50 yards back, just watching her. He wasn't trying to hide this time. He just stood there, staring. He made no move to walk past her. He was just waiting. The peace of the forest was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp fear. Every instinct she had, honed by years on the trail, was screaming at her. This was not normal. She quickly swung her pack on and started walking again, much faster this time. She didn't look back, but she could feel him there. She could hear the faint, steady crunch of his footsteps, keeping a perfect distance, shadowing her. She was on a long, winding path with few ways out. She was trapped on this trail with him. Her mind raced. Should she run? Maybe he was faster. Confront him? That could make things worse. For now, she just walked, her senses on fire, her hand hovering near the pocket with her pepper spray. The beautiful forest now felt like a trap. After what felt like forever, she saw him again. He had cut through the woods and was now standing on the trail ahead of her, blocking her path. The friendly act was gone. His expression was intense, his eyes wide and unsettling. "I just want to talk," he said. His voice was calm, which somehow made it even scarier. Beth's fear turned into cold, focused anger. I don't want to talk, she said, her voice loud and firm. Leave me alone. He took a step towards her. No, you don't understand, he insisted, taking another step. We need to talk. That's when Beth knew she had to do something. As he took one more step, lunging toward her, she ripped the pepper spray from her pocket, aimed, and blasted him right in the face. He screamed a high, agonized sound and clawed at his eyes. That was all the time Beth needed. She turned and ran. She sprinted down the trail, her lungs burning, not daring to look back, convinced he was right behind her. She ran harder than she had ever run in her life. After a few minutes of frantic running, she risked a look over her shoulder. He wasn't there. But she didn't slow down. What did he want? What would he have done if he'd caught her? Finally gasping for air, she rounded a bend and saw something that made her cry with relief. Another couple hiking towards her. She stumbled towards them, babbling about the man. Seeing her terror, the couple immediately understood. The man told Beth to stay with his partner while he went back down the trail. A few tense minutes later, he returned, marching the stalker in front of him. The man, later identified as Chuck, was still suffering from the pepper spray, his face red and swollen. He was quiet and didn't resist. They managed to get a weak cell signal and called the police. While they waited, the full, horrifying picture started to come together. The couple said they had seen Chuck on the trail before, acting strangely. When the police arrived and took him into custody, their investigation revealed something much more sinister. They discovered Chuck had been living in an abandoned cabin hidden deep in the woods, not far from the trail. Inside, they found evidence that he had been watching and documenting hikers for some time. There were crude maps of the trails, notes about hikers' routines, and detailed descriptions of people he'd seen, including a chillingly accurate description of Beth. He had been stalking people from the cover of the forest. On that day, he had decided to finally make contact with his target. Beth's story is a harrowing reminder that the dangers in the wilderness aren't always wild. Her quick thinking and being prepared likely saved her from something much, much worse. It proves that even in wide open spaces, you can be just as vulnerable as you are in a locked home. That feeling of being watched isn't paranoia when there's a predator living just beyond the tree line, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows. If these stories send a chill down your spine, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more true horror. And if you have a story of your own, something that still keeps you up at night, share it in the comments below. You never know who else has been through the same thing. Stay safe and always check the shadows.